Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear,
business consultant.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear Business Consulting.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jay Shear with Jay Shear Business Consulting. We build solid foundations for service-based businesses to grow and scale and achieve the results and success they deserve. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Walt Disney said, "We keep moving forward, opening new doors and doing new things because we're curious, and curiosity keeps leading us down new paths." Well, on today's episode, we talk about curiosity, dealing with failure, mentorship, the Nobel Prize, and more. Our guest is a husband, a father of 5, and grandfather of 6. He's a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Medicine, Professor of Biochemistry and Chemistry at the Duke University Medical Center, and has been a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator since 1976. He, along with Brian Kobilka, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2012 for their research on G-protein coupled receptors. In addition to being a researcher, he's a cardiologist as well as a cardiac patient. His latest book, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm, gives us a glimpse into the life of one of today's leading scientists. Please welcome the man whose curiosity knows no bounds and was described by the press corps in Sweden as the happiest laureate, Dr. Bob Lefkowitz. Bob, thank you so much for being here. It is great to see you.
My pleasure, and my pleasure to be with you today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I'm grateful for you. So let's jump right in. We've got a lot to talk about here, and I'm super excited about this conversation. So why don't we start, if you could take us back a bit to some of the early times where your origin story really begins and some of the experiences that you had, Bob, early on that shaped the person who you are today and ultimately led to the work that you do.
Well, sometimes when I speak to student groups about my career, I title the talk, A Tale of Two Callings. Okay. I think most people have an intuitive sense of what we mean by a calling. It's a not totally rational sense that you are somehow intended by fate or deity or whatever to do a specific thing. We generally associate the term a calling with the clergy, okay? But you can feel a calling to just about anything. And as I look back on my life, I realize that I have had that feeling of a calling on 2 separate occasions. And they essentially shaped the two aspects of my dual career as a physician and a scientist. The first was when I was probably no more than 7 or 8 years old, when I was totally taken by my local physician, a Dr. Joseph Feibush, who made house calls in the Bronx, where I was growing up. And he would come to the house when one of us was ill, and he had that black bag out of which he would produce all manner of magical instruments, stethoscope, otoscope, tongue depressors, syringes. I mean, wow. And he'd let me play with them, whatever. So I was convinced by age 7 or 8 that my calling, of course I didn't know the term, was to be a physician. And I never wavered from that. Went right through special high school, chemistry major at Columbia, and then medical school at Columbia Medical School. In terms of experiences that were shaping me during this time, I was a very voracious and really early reader. I mean, I loved reading. My parents had a modest library, but it was not enough to keep me engaged because, as you said, I was so curious. So I used to go to the library and cart home 6 books a week, which was the maximum. In fact, I used to routinely feign illness, usually a stomach ache, to convince my mother to let me stay home. And then as soon as she was gone, I would spread out on the couch, stack up my books, and just read. And I loved science, and I loved medical fiction, etc. But anyway, the interesting thing is I was so intent on becoming a physician that at no point in either college or medical school did I ever do any research. I loved science, but I was not interested in actually doing research myself. So whenever we had electives, for example, in medical school, when many of my classmates would spend a couple of 3 months doing research, I always did clinical electives because I wanted to hone my clinical skills as quickly as possible. I would not have ever become a scientist were it not for a very serendipitous set of circumstances. And that was that I graduated from medical school in 1966, when the Vietnam War was raging. It was a very unpopular war. There were demonstrations, even riots. Many of us who tilted left or were way over on the left felt the war was at best immoral and possibly illegal. Nobody wanted to go. But in addition to the lottery draft for all men over 18, there was an actual draft called the doctor's draft for graduates of medical school. So when you graduated medical school in the 60s, you were drafted. You went in and you went in as an officer into the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Public Health Service. The first three services pretty much guaranteed you would spend one of your 2 years in the war theater, which nobody wanted to do. The Public Health Service, you had at least a chance of staying stateside because they needed physicians to staff jails, to staff other military installations, and in particular to staff research installations like the NIH and the CDC that we hear so much about these days. Okay. But you can imagine how competitive it was to get those commissions. That's what everybody wanted to do. So they only got the best and the brightest. It was extraordinarily competitive. But I had high academic standing, had been to great schools, and so I was able to get a commission as a lieutenant commander in the Public Health Service, and I was assigned to the NIH to spend about 20% of my time taking care of patients in the clinical center who were there for research studies, but 80% of the time assigned to a research laboratory to help my mentors doing research and to in turn learn how to do research myself, okay? It was called the Clinical Associate Program. In an interesting, now I was not there because I wanted to learn how to do research. I wanted to get on with my career, but this was better than going to Vietnam. Now, interestingly, the program that I was in, although technically called the Associate Training Program, was pejoratively referred to by members of other armed services, as well as, frankly, kind of tongue-in-cheek by ourselves as the Yellow Berets, which was a takeoff on Green Berets, you know, our most elite fighting forces, and yellow representing cowardice. But we didn't really look at ourselves that way at all. But the term Yellow Beret would go on to be the opposite in time, because the output of that program, which was small, maybe 100 physicians a year through the 60s, was unbelievable. My research initially went poorly, and that was quite an experience because I had never failed at anything, ever, in a protracted way. And for the first year and a half at the NIH, nothing worked. But I just dug in and finally made it work, began to like it, but not enough that I was willing to stay on, et cetera. So I wrote a few papers and moved on with my clinical training to the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. There, I threw myself back into clinical work, which I always loved. But after 6 months, I realized something was missing. And I began to feel that calling sense again that, hey, you really need to have experimental data every day. You need to be, you know, expressing your curiosity through experiments. You're going to have to figure out some way to incorporate research back into your career. So I found another mentor up there. And for the next 2.5 years in Boston, I split my time between finishing general medicine training, cardiology training, and working in the laboratory. And then moved to Duke in 1973 as an academic physician scientist and a junior faculty member in medicine and biochemistry. And when I first came here, I still wasn't 100% convinced what the mix of physician and scientist would be. And during my first year, it was almost 50-50. But within 2 or 3 years, my research just took off. And next thing I knew, I was spending 85% of my time in the laboratory and only 10 or 15% doing clinical teaching. And as they say, the rest is history. Never
Amazing.
would I have imagined when I was going through as a kid, if somebody would have told me that you're going to wind up being a scientist and winning the Nobel Prize in chemistry, I would have looked at them like they were crazy. I mean, it had nothing to do with what I was planning. And so when I talk to students, I always stress to them, well, it's great to have plans, but just be prepared. You know, you don't know how the story turns out.
It's really an incredible one. And there's so many layers to this story, but I want to wind back for a moment because your time at NIH, this was such a life-changing experience in a number of different ways. And during this time, you mentioned the word failure, that you were doing experiments, and the experiments were not, you weren't accomplishing the results that you were hoping for the first year and a half. Now, during this time of service, was this a 2-year service stint?
Yes, it was.
Okay. So you talked about failure, but then also this was a time of loss for you as well. And you experienced some very difficult and challenging times in your personal life. So let's talk about what happened. Your father was a very relevant part of your life, someone who you looked up to, someone who provided an immense amount of guidance and mentorship for you. So talk about your father a bit. What happened during the time that you were at NIH? And then I want to talk about failure for a moment and how we process that, please.
You're absolutely right. And I appreciate your bringing that up. So my father developed early coronary artery disease, had his first myocardial infarction, his first heart attack when he was 50. I was only 12 at the time. And that had a big impact on me. My mother also developed early coronary artery disease, although thank goodness she lived a much longer life. But I was in the clinic one afternoon at the NIH when I received, this was in December, mid-December. So I'd only been there less than 6 months. And I received a call that my father had had a 4th heart attack, and that shortly thereafter I got another call that he had passed away. And this was devastating for me. I was an only child. As you said, I have 5 of my own. Maybe that was a reaction to being an only child. But I had no siblings to mourn with me. And it was particularly meaningful because I was very close to my dad, much so, more so than my mother. He was a simple, straightforward, gentle, wonderful man. He was an accountant by trade. And whenever I had a problem in my life, I always went to him with it. Even if he knew nothing about it, he could always, there's a Yiddish word called seichel, okay? Seichel means wisdom, okay? He had wisdom. He just was a wise man. And so when we were in New York, of course, I was living at that point in Rockville when I was in Maryland with my wife and already 3 children. 3 children. It was a very different era. I was in my mid-20s. I already had 3 kids. We had gone back to New York for Thanksgiving holiday, and I was miserable because nothing worked. And I had a long talk with my dad, and he listened. And he said, look, why are you letting this upset you so much? You always had the dream of being a physician. You're well on your way. You're not in Vietnam. You'll do the remaining year and a half of service. Keep your nose clean. You'll go up to Boston. You'll finish your training. And then you'll have the life you always wanted as a physician. Well, it was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was great. We had a plan. Went back to the NIH, and it was great. Next thing I know, I get this phone call. So that conversation was literally the last conversation I had with my father. And as I mourned him, which went on for quite a while, I was really, as I look back on it, I think I was significantly depressed at the time. As I look back on it, I realized that one of the things, even as the research began to really take off in subsequent years, one of the things that held me back from making a full-throated commitment to being a scientist was I had a deal with my dad. We figured it out together. I'm going to go back. I'm going to become the physician I always dreamed of, frankly, the physician he always dreamed of. And here I was. I'd look at myself in the mirror in the morning and say, wait a minute, you're becoming a scientist. That's not what Dad and you figured out. It took me a while to sort of get past that. I think the transition might have happened more quickly were it not for that reticence on my part about the deal that I made with Dad. But you're right, it was a very difficult period for me.
Absolutely. And also, as you reflect back and you talk about failure, this was at least a time that you've spoken about and also wrote about where failure started to enter the equation, and you hadn't necessarily experienced failure to the degree that you were at this point. So, and that's such an important aspect of life in general, but in the type of work that you were doing at the time, the failure rate is significant. But if you haven't experienced that before and you haven't lived that yet, it's a very difficult thing to deal with. So walk us through a bit how you process failure, perhaps going back to how you dealt with failure at that time, but then what you've learned over the years and how important failure truly is.
Well, when I was at the NIH, as I said, to that point, I had met with minimal failure, but the failure to me up to that point was bumps in the road. Examples. One of the few things I ever failed at, even briefly, was when I was in, I think, junior high school. And to pass physical education, you had to climb a rope up to the top of the gym. And you had to be able to do some tumbling where you would jump over two of your classmates and tumble. I couldn't do those two things. So my father worked with me. We set up pillows at home and I would jump over those. We had a summer home. He bought a professional climber's rope, tied it to a high branch, even though he didn't know anything about either of those things. And together we figured out how to climb the rope. That was my idea of failure. A bump in the road, you figure out. But here I couldn't do that. My best effort was thwarted for 12, 15 months. And I remember one day I was sitting in the cafeteria having lunch, feeling kind of morose. This was after Dad was gone. And a senior scientist who worked down the hall from me, but was not my mentor, came to talk to me. And he said, I heard from your boss that you're really down about the research. He says, failure is really a part of this game. He said, do you have any idea for an average scientist what fraction of their experiments actually really work and give them useful information? I said, no. He said, well, it's probably about 1%. I said, oh my God. He said, but no, wait a minute. He says, how about for a superstar, like a Nobel Laureate, something like that? What fraction of their experiments do you think work? I said, I don't know. He said, could be as high as 2%. And so immediately, even though, I won't hold them to the numbers, frankly, I think 2% is too high. But anyway, it gave me a sense of, look, even for the very best in the game, most of the time, this doesn't work. So that was the first thing. I did not do well dealing with failure at the beginning, for the reasons we talked about. I had no experience with it. But, with a lot of encouragement, and when I finally began to meet with success, I began to process it better and to understand, that failure and success are really just sort of two sides of the same coin. One ultimately most of the time will lead to the other. But then, as I went along in life and career, I had occasion to hear talks by numerous very successful people. Okay, there's one organization in particular called the Academy of Achievement. They say it's the most elite organization that nobody's ever heard of. And I encourage you to Google it, Academy of Achievement. It was started 65, 70 years ago by a philanthropist who was either a journalist or a photojournalist. And now his son and daughter-in-law have taken it over. But basically, it's like an organization that they select people to join based on high achievement, okay, in any walk of life, any walk of life. And then at their expense, they bring these people together once every year or two, usually pre-pandemic in a very nice location. And you have several days of networking, getting together and talks. And so I've been a member of that organization, which it's every walk of life, from sports figures to celebrities to rich people, to Nobel laureates, to college coaches. I mean, and I met a lot of really famous people there. And I've heard a lot of talks there. I don't think I've heard a talk where one of the stress points by the person speaking isn't that how much failure they met with early in their career. I mean, that seems to be a universal feature of successful careers. Now, I got to assume that unsuccessful people also met with failure, not just early in their career, but maybe throughout their career. But for really successful people, they all talk about the fact that early failure was present and how important it was as a springboard. I mean, and you listen to these people, and these are people whose success, you've admired forever and ever. I mean, what's the name? I'm terrible at this stage of my life with names, but the guy who made the Star Wars movies, do you know his name?
I do. I can, George Lucas.
Yeah.
George
Lucas. Yeah. He gave a talk, same story. I mean, he was getting nowhere. I mean, he was a total failure. And then he came up with this idea, which everybody thought was stupid, but somehow he got some people together and made the first movie. And again, the rest is history. But all the stories are like that. Just amazing.
It truly is. I look over the list of guests that I've had on this show, hundreds of guests. And like you just mentioned, high achievers, top performers, top of their game, like you. There isn't one conversation that I've had where some through line to that conversation ties back to a failure in life, some adversity that this individual had to overcome. And it was a change in perspective. It was using that failure as fuel, as catalyst, like you said, a springboard to move past and figure out a way to continue to move forward. And that always seems to be the key, is a focus on going to the next step, figuring out a way, using curiosity, not allowing that failure only says that, hey, this particular way didn't work. Let's try it this way.
Right.
And
exactly right. And I actually give a talk here at Duke to the research fellows once every year or two. They trot me out to do it. And it's called How to Deal with Failure in Research, something like that is the title. And always gets a big crowd. And I have some, a little PowerPoint presentation. One of them is a copy of an article which appeared, I think it was reprinted in the New York Times a number of years ago. But it was making the point that somebody did a study of people who were right on the line for getting the research funded by the NIH. So when you put in a grant to the NIH, it gets a score. And depending on what's going on, it's like I say, it's a percentile score. And let's say the funding line is 10%. That means if you were in the top 10% or better, you'll get funded that cycle. But if you were 10.5, you don't. Okay. And then you have a chance to revise it and put it in again. Okay. So they did a study of the people who got funded versus those who, and when they say got funded, they were talking about the ones, let's say the funding line was 10. These were people who got 9. So they got funded, but they kind of barely made it. And the other group were the people who got 11. Okay. I'm making the numbers up, but these are the people who narrowly missed. Okay. So you had some that succeeded and some that failed. And then they followed them for a very long period of time. And the thesis was that the ones who failed did better in the long run, had more successful careers. You might be able to find that on the New York Times, or you can write to me and I'll send you the slide. And that's kind of interesting. And then, they made the obvious point that, well, why would that be? Well, it's not so obvious. I think, there are various perspectives on why that. One, I think, is the interesting point you made, that, yeah, I mean, when you fail, for many of us, you say, wait a minute, I'm not going to take this line. I'm going to make this work. Whereas when it comes easy, there's less fire in the belly. I think another reason that successful people fail a lot is that they're willing to take on big challenges. Difficult problems is what we would say in my field, but whatever it is. And they have, again, what we call in Yiddish chutzpah, which is very important in science and I'm sure in many other areas. And yeah, to the extent that you take on a really challenging problem, your chances of failing are much higher. In my business, it's very easy to be productive in the sense of writing papers. Just work on trivial things. They're easy to do, and you can write lots of papers. But frankly, people won't care all that much, and they won't cite them because you're not providing any great new information.
Absolutely. So I want to mention one other thing about your time during the NIH that really is remarkable when you think about it. When you were first describing your time there, you talked about, these were the best of the best, right? That were assembled and were part of this group at the NIH. You've mentioned in I believe I read it in your book, and I've also heard you speak about this before, where in the 2 years that you were there, your class, speak to the number of Nobel Prize winners that came out of that class, and then overall throughout the years that program was running.
I'm so glad you asked that question because it is a truly, truly remarkable statistic. So I told you the program had maybe 100 people a year. We all had the following things in common. One, we were all men because we were drafted, right? There was no draft for women, okay? We were all men. We were all recent medical school graduates. 90% of us had an MD only, not a PhD. A few had here and there had an MD and a PhD, which is very common these days, but in those days, almost nobody had both an MD and a PhD. So we're young physicians right out of medical school and a couple of years of house staff training. And most of us with absolutely no experience in research or a trivial experience in research. That's the substrate. Then they put us at the NIH for 2 years, okay? Not 10 years, not a PhD, 2 years, some of which time you spent doing clinical work. So in my class, the class that came in 1968 and left in 70, and we all did leave in 70, in that class, 4 of us went on to win the Nobel Prize, which is staggering. But let me tell you one other thing about my class. Not everybody who came out of this program who was great won the Nobel Prize. In fact, my whole generation of academic physician scientists, basically trained over about a 10 or 15-year period in this program. But one of my classmates at the NIH, same class that gave you the 4 Nobel laureates, was a guy you may have heard of, Tony Fauci. Okay, so I first met Tony Fauci at the NIH, what is it, 50, whatever number of years ago. We were all friends. We rotated night call, in the clinical center. And here we are 50 years later, and he's Tony Fauci, and I'm not. But anyway, I am a big fan of Tony's, and we keep up, not all that closely because he's so busy. But I would say I've been in touch with him maybe half a dozen times during the pandemic by email. And I always get back 2 emails. One that comes back within an hour from his staff saying Dr. Fauci is too busy to respond to emails, but please know that he appreciates your feedback, etc. And then within 24 hours from Tony himself saying, sorry for that, Bob, but whatever. So in addition, between 64 and 72, which was an 8-year period, which was the sort of the center cut, if you will, of the Vietnam War, 10 of us went on to win the Nobel Prize. And I mean, it's staggering. There's no comparable figure for any institution, especially over that period of time. And essays have been written, including by many friends of mine and even myself, as to what the heck could we do to do that again? Because the number of physician scientists is declining, very markedly so. And, one has to say, where's the next Tony Fauci going to come from? Who's going to be the guy 20 years from now when there's a pandemic or God knows what? Because we just don't train physician scientists. That's another whole topic. But a lot of analysis of the yellow beret phenomenon has been done trying to uncover what was the secret sauce that did this. And, I have ideas. Everybody has some ideas. But can it be replicated? To be totally honest, I don't think so.
If you were to summarize the reason why you see that decline happening, what would that be? If you could point to 1, 2, or 3 things, what is the cause of this decline?
I think there are several things. One is the length of time it takes to develop the dual career, as opposed to going straight into clinical medicine. 2, related to that, the tremendous expense of doing this, such that most medical students wind up with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt for loans they have to take through college and medical school. And then there just isn't much support for young faculty at the assistant professor level as they're trying to establish their research career. It's very difficult. The average, I was 30 when I came to Duke and set up my lab. And I had no difficulty at all getting an NIH grant right off the bat. At the time, the funding line was 30th percentile, okay? Today, the funding line is more like about 10 percentile, okay? And I told you I was 30 years old when I wrote that grant. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to write a grant, but still I got it. Today, the average age of a physician getting their first grant from the NIH is something like 42 or 43 years of age. By then, they've been struggling for years with funding, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to have monies to support them during that early phase of their career so they can establish their research programs. We also, medical education has changed dramatically. So people, even though I wasn't interested in research in medical school, I was very interested in science, and I loved the first 2 years of medical school, which are all basic science. Today, the basic sciences have been downgraded. Many schools like Duke are going to programs where there's only 1 year of basic science. And so the kids are much less schooled in science and the scientific approach to medicine. It's much more about just learning, almost like being a mechanic. If you have this, you do that, rather than deeply understanding the scientific basis for disease and therapeutics, et cetera. And that's changing that, because that's what really, in the end, I think attracts people to a combined career as a scientist and a physician. But again, so the education is not there. Another thing, there have been some programs in the past which supported medical students to take a year out of medical school and do research, just to sort of see what it's like. Those programs have been very successful in interesting students in such careers. Now, I hasten to point out, however, were such programs available in my day, I wouldn't have taken it, because I had no interest in doing research at all. But anyway, so there are two places you can grab them. In medical school, if you can attract their interest, or after residency training, which is in a sense what I did. But yeah, so it's very multifactorial why there is this terrible decline in physician scientists. Currently, only 1.5% of all physicians will answer yes when asked the question, do you do any research as part of your career? And by research, I don't mean necessarily biochemistry. It could be pure clinical research, whatever. So 98.5% of all physicians do not do any research.
That's staggering.
It is staggering.
It truly is.
And it's very sad.
It is. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, and that'll have to be a separate conversation, but I wanted to better understand the reasons behind that. And I'm sure that, as you said, it's multifaceted and there's more to it, but thank you for sharing that. So let's change gears here for a moment, and let's go to the moment when you received the phone call that you are the recipient of the Nobel Prize. Walk us through very briefly what transpired when you received that phone call. What was the feeling like at that moment? And then we're going to talk about your latest book. Okay.
It is kind of an experience that you remember for the rest of your life. I have many friends and colleagues who've won the Nobel Prize. And whenever one of my buddies would win the prize and I would have the opportunity to be with them at a meeting or someplace not that long after, like everybody else, what was it like? I mean, you just want to know. And every experience is different. Now, my experience was that I had been touted as a potential Nobel laureate for probably 20 years before I won the prize. Okay, people have been talking about me winning, and I was forever pestered with questions like, Bob, when do you think you'll win? Are you going to win? Isn't it about time you won? There were several prizes awarded where people thought I should have shared the prize, but I didn't. Is that rare? No. There are very few Nobel Prizes that can be awarded, and there's lots of work that's worthy. So you got to get lucky. That's part of it. But I would be less than forthright if I said I had never thought about getting a Nobel Prize. People often ask me, well, were you surprised when the call came? And I always say yes and no. So why no? Why was I not surprised? Well, because people for 20 years had been telling me I'm going to win the Nobel Prize. I mean, I would have to have my head in the sand not to be aware of the fact that people thought the work was at a level where that could happen. But yes, I was surprised because so many years had gone by. I was 69 years old. So many years had gone by. I had not won it. I had spent, a period of years in my probably late 50s and 60s where during the awarding, they announced the prizes all in 1 week in October. And then the award ceremony is 2 months later in December. So during that week of announcements, which everybody knows, and it's one award per day, always in the same order: medicine on Monday, physics Tuesday, chemistry Wednesday, et cetera, et cetera. So the year that I won, when I say yes, I was surprised. Monday had come and gone, the medicine prize. I certainly hadn't been awakened with a call, nor frankly at that point did I any longer have any expectation that I would. Plus, usually in any given year, there's a little buzz about, well, who it might be this year. And I can assure you, there was no buzz. I had heard nothing. There are even sites you can go to on the internet which are predicting who will win in a given year. To be honest with you, there are places where you can bet on who's going to win. You can bet on anything, but you can bet on that. And I can assure you, my name and Kobilka's name were nowhere to be seen. Plus, they had awarded the medicine prize on Monday, and it wasn't me. So now we're on Wednesday. I'm sleeping well. I sleep with earplugs and a mask, so I'm dead to the world. But at 5 a.m., my wife gives me an elbow, and I said, "What's going on?" I didn't even hear the phone ring. She says, there's a woman calling from the Royal Swedish Academy. She wants to speak to Professor Lefkowitz. So in that instant, of course, I realized what was going on. But I remember thinking to myself, chemistry? What is that all about? So I got on. They immediately told me that I had won the prize. I immediately asked, am I sharing it with anybody? Because you never know what they're going to do. They told me Kobilka, one of my previous students, actually, who had worked with me in the 80s. And that was very powerful to hear that I was sharing it with one of my trainees. And then they tell you, you can't tell anybody. It's a secret for another hour until we announce it publicly. No, as you said, I have 5 kids and grandkids. I wanted to immediately call everybody up and tell them the good news, but I couldn't do it. But the question you asked was, well, what did it feel like? Well, some people, it's like a eureka moment. There's a movie, you probably didn't see it, a couple of years ago called The Wife, okay? And it concerns a guy who wins the Nobel Prize in literature, okay? But it turns out that his wife, who was previously his student and is also a writer, had actually been doing a lot of the writing for him. Anyway, the movie begins with him receiving a call. Okay, that's the first scene of the movie. And it shows him and his wife jumping up and down, hugging each other in the bed, dancing, etc. That was not how I responded. It was much more of a quiet sense of satisfaction and that the monkey is off my back and the certain knowledge that never again will I have to answer the question, Bob, when do you think you're going to win the Nobel Prize? And that was a good feeling. So then I made a pot of coffee, and my wife and I sat around until the announcement an hour later at 6 a.m. East Coast time, which is, 11 a.m. over in Stockholm. But one of the things that I always regretted a little bit is that as soon as that announcement was made, my phone lit up, both my cell phone, the house line, New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press. And I couldn't get to a free phone to call my kids. So by the time I did, 3 of the 5 already knew through Facebook or friends calling them. So I only got to tell 2 of the kids. The other 3 already knew. But that's okay. But anyway, it's a life-changing experience, I can tell you that.
Incredible. So after the announcement's made, you had the opportunity to at least tell a few of your children. Outside of family, who was the first person that you called to share the news and were so excited to be able to share that with someone outside of your family?
My secretary, who's now retired, Donna Addison, Southern gal, Durham, had been my secretary, was still my secretary at that time, for 40 some odd years. And she was the first one I called. I called her up, I guess it was around 7:30. And I said, Donna, I want you to brace yourself. It's going to be one hell of a crazy day in the office today. She said, why? What's going on? And I told her. And she knew about the fact that undoubtedly we both knew I had been nominated for the prize, because people would contact the office. You know, it's supposed to be a big, deep, dark secret. People would contact the office. Can I have Dr. Lefkowitz's CV? Or do you have this piece of information about him? And I think she had been involved in some of those efforts without even telling me. So she was one of the first. The other was my closest friend, a guy named Ralph Snyderman, who had been the CEO of Duke Medical Center from '89 to 2004. We had been running buddies for 40 years, called him. And then I sent out a few emails, to the president of the university, the provost, et cetera. But it was a crazy day. There was a press conference, and they somehow managed to organize a huge university-wide reception by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which is pretty impressive. Yeah,
that is impressive. What an amazing experience.
Yeah. And it turned out, to my surprise, I was the very first Nobel laureate in the history of Duke University, which
is that
I didn't
right?
realize that myself. Yeah, very surprising. To my delight, 3 years after I won in 2012, a colleague of mine in biochemistry, Paul Modrich, also won in chemistry. So we got two laureates in the history of the university. We both got them within 3 years of each other. So I guess we were on a roll at that point.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. So I want to talk for a moment about a funny thing happened on the way to Stockholm. So this is a book that you write. It's a memoir. And I want to share with our listeners and those that are watching right now that this book goes into a lot of detail about many of the things we're talking about here right now. And so we have just barely scratched the surface, but this is definitely a book you want to pick up because it is filled with great stories. It's filled with humor. It's filled with, there's some tears in there as well, but it really it paints a very nice picture of how poignant your life has been. And you did a great job putting this together. Here's what I wanted you to speak to, which I think is a really interesting process. The way you brought this book to life. This wasn't you sitting down and just writing every single day, right? You're collaborating on this book. So just very briefly, give us a thumbnail of how you brought this book to life.
Very interesting experience. So I am, as you may have realized from this brief interaction, a bit of a raconteur. I can't help myself. I love listening to stories and I love telling stories. And everybody who works with me over the years, and I've had something like 250 trainees so far in my career, they are a captive audience for my stories. And if they spend too long with me, they start hearing the stories more than once. Some of them even keep lists of the stories. And for years, people in my lab have been encouraging me to write a book with all my stories in it. They said, Bob, your stories are so engaging. Why don't you just write a book with your stories? I never would have done it. But then there was one guy who was one of my favorite postdocs in the 90s named Randy Hall. He's now a full professor of pharmacology at Emory, an avid Duke basketball fan, as am I. And he was up several years ago to see a game with me. I have season tickets. And over dinner, he pitched to me a proposal. He said, I know you said you're never going to write your stories down, but how about this? He says, I fancy myself a bit of a writer. How about if we collaborated? We'll spend whatever amount of time is necessary. You'll tell me your stories, as best you can remember them. Going chronologically, we'll take different phases of your life. And I'll record everything. And I'll write up a chapter, send it to you, we'll edit it, and we'll just keep going. Well, I said, that might work. Our model for this was a book by a Nobel Prize winning physicist named Richard Feynman, called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. Okay, same idea. The genre is called As Told To. Okay, so Feynman told his stories to a former trainee of his, and I would do the same. Although unlike Feynman's book, which is mostly almost disconnected stories, this, as you know, is actually a story. I mean, it tells my life. So we started doing this. We set aside originally an hour and a half a week, but it quickly became 2 hours or more. I would tell him stories. He would jot down notes and record it. He developed the narrative structure. And then he would send me a chapter, I would edit it. And we did this weekly for just about 1 year. Okay, so it was a lot of time, well over 100 hours for sure. And that's how the manuscript came to be. My biggest concern going in, and even as I would edit chapters, was that he was not capturing my voice. I would read it and I'd say, but it doesn't sound exactly like me. But I can tell you, and this is interesting to me, because I'm sure you've heard your own voice all the time on tape, okay? And the one thing you know when you listen to your own voice, that everybody knows when they listen to their own voice, is, I know that's not what I sound like, right? You know you don't sound like that. Well, I think the same thing obtains here, because when we gave the book to several people who know me very well, the manuscript, well before we submitted it for publication, we asked them to critique various things, and in particular, to comment on the voice. How close, if at all, does it come to capturing my voice? And to a person, they said it was perfect, that this is exactly how you sound. So again, as we listen to our voice on tape, and obviously when you use the word voice for a manuscript, we're not talking about, it's a different thing, but the voice is mine. He captured it, even though it didn't sound quite right to me. Every once in a while, he would use an expression, all of which I scrubbed out, which I knew was not part of my vocabulary. And it was often I think a generational thing. So for example, in several parts of the book in the manuscript, he has me hanging out with somebody. I say, Randy, I don't hang out, okay? I spend time with people, I visit with people, I don't hang out, okay? So there were a few things like that, which I got rid of. But yeah, it was a real collaboration.
What an amazing story. We're going to link to be able to purchase the book in the show
Wonderful.
notes, as well as some information for you where everyone can learn more about you. And Bob, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for bringing your incredible charisma, your life story, and inspiring us. So thank you so very much. I'm grateful for you.
Thank you very much, Jay. I very much enjoyed chatting with you. And
Absolutely.
as you noted, I've been having coffee along with our chat.
Yes, sir. And I appreciate that. Business Minds Coffee Chat. And for all of you, thank you so very much for watching and listening. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and would you leave us a review? We would greatly appreciate that. And to enjoy more episodes and to learn how Jay Shear Business Consulting can help build a solid foundation for your service-based business, all you have to do is visit jayshearbusinessconsulting.com. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing, pick up a copy of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Stockholm, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear.
Jay Shear
Business Consultant.
Jay Shear Business Consulting.